Welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week on the program, the G20 admits the African Union as a permanent member during its two-day meeting in India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi made the announcement at the start of the summit in New Delhi. AU President Azali Assoumani celebrated the bloc's admission of making the grouping more representative. We'll be joined later by a lawyer of national security and foreign policy, Joanna LeBlanc, in Washington to discuss the advantages and challenges of the G20, admitting the African Union as a partner. Plus, the British warship, the HMS Trent, berths in Lagos. We'll have details on that. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. A quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles, and we'll be right back.
The Nigerian government has commiserated with the government and people of the Kingdom of Morocco over the devastating 6.8 magnitude earthquake that struck the southwestern part of Marrakesh late on Friday, September 8, 2023. A statement from the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Francisca Omayuli, said, Nigeria is deeply saddened by the impacts of the earthquake that left over 1,000 people dead and several others injured. The government and people of Nigeria extend their deepest condolences to the bereaved families and pray for the speedy recovery of the injured. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Russian President Vladimir Putin has already lost in what he was trying to achieve, referring to the war in Ukraine. Mr. Blinken's recent visit to Ukraine on Wednesday was overshadowed by a Russian attack that killed at least 17 people. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky condemned the attack, which hit a crowded market in the eastern frontline town of Konstantinivka, close to the devastated city of Bakhmut.
Putin has already lost in what he was trying to achieve. He was trying to erase Ukraine from the map and its independence, subsume it into Russia. That has already been a failure. Now, where exactly this settles, where lines are drawn, that is going to be up to Ukrainians. But I've found a strong determination to continue to work to get their territory back that's been seized by Russia. And as to negotiations, John, it takes two to tango. Sure. And thus far, we see no indication that Vladimir Putin has any interest in meaningful diplomacy. If he does, I think the Ukrainians will be the first to engage, and we'll be right behind them. Everyone wants this war to end, but it has to end on just terms and on durable terms that reflect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Le 1er septembre 2023.
Finally, Niger's junta has accused France of deploying troops in several West African countries as part of preparations for a possible military intervention with the regional bloc ECOWAS against Niger. In a communique read on state television overnight, the junta also repeated its call for the departure of French troops from its territory, a major source of tension between the one-time allies since the July 26th ouster of President Mohamed Bazoum. The statement appealed to national and international opinion to witness the consequences of this aggressive, underhanded, and contemptuous attitude adopted by France. Relations between Niger and its former colonizer France have soured since Paris declared the junta illegitimate amid a wave of anti-French sentiment. The coup's leaders have also followed the strategy of junta in neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso in seeking to end long-standing military ties with France and the region-wide fight against deadly Islamist insurgencies.
De ce plan de retrait, la France continue.
Welcome back. The African Union has now become a full member of the G20, the group of developing countries of the world. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi welcomed AU chairperson Azali Assoumani on Saturday and invited the bloc to take a seat at the summit in India. Mr. Modi said the AU joining the G20 would make it more representative.
The African Union was made a permanent member of the G20, comprising the world's richest and most powerful countries, according to the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Saturday, September the 9th. The African Union, a continental body of 55 member states, now has the same status as the European Union, the only regional bloc with a full membership. Its previous designation was Invited International Organization. Mr. Modi, in his opening remarks at the summit, invited the AU, represented by the chairperson Azali Assoumani, to take a seat at the table of G20 leaders as a permanent member. Spokesperson for the South African President, Vincent Magwenya, described the move as a major step towards global reforms, adding that issues like global change could include affected parties bearing the most responsibility.
It was always a myth that you will have such forums for international economic cooperation running with the exclusion of large parts of the world. Now we are moving towards a direction that includes those parts of the world that were excluded. We share a lot of common challenges, particularly with respect to climate change. And those issues cannot be resolved through exclusive approaches. They have to be inclusive. They have to include those affected and those that bear the most responsibility in guiding the world through these challenges.
African Union President Azali Assoumani celebrated the bloc's admission to the G20. He said the admission will help a lot, despite Africa's internal issues. He said the continent must find solutions to the issues, but that it cannot work alone and has to work with other countries, especially countries in the G20. Other issues raised at the summit include the coup in Niger, in which President Emmanuel Macron said that if France ever had to redeploy troops in Niger, it would only do so in coordination with ousted leader Mohamed Bazoum, the only leader of the country that France recognizes. He, however, did not address allegations that France was deploying troops elsewhere in West Africa as part of a regional proposal to use force as a last resort to restore democracy. Meanwhile, global leaders announced a multinational rail and ports deal linking the Middle East and South Asia. The pact comes as U.S. President Joe Biden seeks to counter China's Belt and Road push on global infrastructure by pitching Washington as an alternative partner and investor for developing countries at the G20 grouping. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the deal would feature a rail link to improve transport between Asia, the Middle East and Europe, and energy connections for electricity and hydrogen.
As we work to address infrastructure gaps across low- and middle-income countries, we need to maximize the impact of our investments. That's why a few months ago I announced that the United States will work with our partners to invest in economic corridors. In practice, it means we're focusing on regional infrastructure projects that deliver results across multiple countries and in multiple sectors.
This is nothing but historic. It will be the most direct connection to date between India, the Arabian Gulf, and Europe, with a rail link that will make trade between India and Europe 40% faster, with an electricity cable and a clean hydrogen pipeline to foster clean energy trade between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe.
The G20 adopted a consensus declaration at the summit that avoided condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine, but called on all states not to use force to grab territory. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi had announced that the leaders' declaration was adopted on the first day of the weekend G20 summit in New Delhi.
Everybody came together for the consensus. But I think if Sherpa would bear me out, I think the emerging markets took a particular lead on this, and many of us have a strong history of working together. Bear in mind that actually you have 4 developing countries in succession as G20 presidency: Indonesia, us, Brazil, and South Africa. So, but I would say, rather than who helped, the point to be recognized is that a common landing point was ultimately fashioned out.
Finally, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak met his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the summit on Saturday. The UK and Indian governments have been in talks for a free trade agreement but are yet to reach any conclusion. Negotiations began in January 2022 and have already missed several political deadlines.
Joining us now is Joanna LeBlanc, a trained lawyer who specializes in national security law and foreign policy. Ms. LeBlanc is also a partner at Adomi Advisory Group PLLC, an international law firm with a global public policy practice headquartered in Washington, D.C., and in Ghana and also in Nigeria. Joanna, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you for having me, Amarachi, as always.
Yes, and a really interesting topic it is, isn't it? Because it kind of beats, the imagination, kind of, for people who are just ordinarily looking at the African Union joining the G20, the group of developing countries of the world. The G20 is like a class of is in a class of its own, and then the AU is also in a class of its own. What do you make of the two worlds coming together, the AU being inducted into the G20?
First and foremost, I think it is a momentous occasion, and it is something that has been lobbied for by African heads of state, and recently supported by the Biden-Harris administration, as well as the United States Congress. And I think this is certainly a step in the right direction, which would enhance global cooperation, which will also help African countries address issues like climate change, sustainable development, and so on. And I think it's a good thing, not just for the African continent, but also the entire world.
Yes, so the AU is already considered as successful as the European Union. I mean, they're both continental bodies. They both have some advantages on the continent, but it's not like the AU has its own currency, which has been harmonized. It also doesn't have trade that's harmonized. So how would a G20 membership fix some of the issues that already exist within the African Union? Knowing that African countries are not yet harmonized, they still do not have a unified currency, they still do not have a unified trade policy. They do have a trade policy, but not everyone is plugged into it.
Well, as it relates to the harmonization of trade, I think this is when we have to look at the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat headquartered in Accra, Ghana. And we saw that the Secretariat, the AU appointed its very first Secretary General in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic when the whole world was shut down. And the mandate is to implement this trade agreement that essentially would lift millions of people out of poverty across the African continent, obviously harmonize the trading of goods and services across the continent, and also make sure there's inclusivity in terms of trade as it relates to women participation. But I think in spite of the challenges, the AFCFTA has done an incredible job at galvanizing the continent around the successful implementation of this trade policy, this trade agreement rather. And just like any legal piece of work or any trade agreement, it's going to take time. It's going to take time to work with different states, with different nations, which each has their own political, economic, and social interest, right? So we have to give it some time. Secretary General was appointed in 2020, again in the middle of the pandemic, but I think there has been a great deal of work that has been done around, obviously, a dispute settlement aspect of the implementation of the trade agreement, because again, we know this, whenever you have a trade deal, there will be disputes that will arise. So I think the African continent, under the leadership of the African Union, is doing an incredible job addressing the issue of trade and harmonizing the process for all nations to benefit and the people of Africa to raise out of poverty.
Yes, but you already have these challenges. I mean, you rightly pointed them out, that it would take time for the African Union to be properly integrated. If they're going to be joining the G20, if the AU, well, the AU is already joining the G20, doesn't that further compound the problem?
No, I don't think so. But what I think is the major problem is, yes, while I applaud the inclusion of the AU into the G20, but similar to the inclusion of the EU Commission and so on within the G20. But there are also independent European countries that are members. So I argue that countries like Nigeria, the most populous country on the African continent, should have a seat at the table. And unfortunately, Nigeria was not successful this time around, and it is my desire to see that Nigeria has a seat at the table for this to be complete. You can't just have the African Union representation without having significant countries like Nigeria being represented, consistent with the representation of European nations within the G20.
Joanna, what exactly could be the gains, for the African Union? It's become the second regional grouping to be admitted as permanent member of the G20. And, I think India had a huge hand to play in this because the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was at the BRICS summit 2 weeks ago. And he talked about how important it will be to have, African voices in many of these groups. The BRICS, of course, had already expanded, added five more countries, Nigeria not amongst them. And we'll come to the issue of Nigeria later. But how exactly does an AU membership benefit the G20?
I think it's a step in the right direction. I don't think it will solve all of our problems, right? In terms of making sure that the voice of African countries are being heard. For example, within the African Union currently, we know there are a number of countries that are suspended from the AU because of lack of democracy, as the AU would call it. You have countries like Niger, Gabon, Burkina Faso, Somalia, South Sudan, I believe, that are not a member, that membership has been suspended because of various undemocratic processes that have been identified by the African Union. So those countries' voices would not be heard at the table. But nonetheless, I believe that through a structured policy agenda, through continuous negotiations with various countries across the continent, I think that it's a good step in the right direction to negotiate better interest rates when it comes to loans, to negotiate issues around climate change, and to further cooperation with nation states around the world.
What about the impact on democracy? You rightly reeled out, some of the countries that have been suspended from the African Union because of undemocratic processes that are taking place in those countries, i.e., coups that have taken place in those countries. How would a G20 membership probably affect, democracy in these countries?
I think a G20 membership, obviously, again, it further promotes the notion of democracy, right? But unfortunately, as I said earlier, those countries whose membership has been suspended into the African Union, they just unfortunately will be left out until they are reintegrated into the African Union. But in the meantime, what I think is important is to ensure that certain economies, certain countries, for example, again, like Nigeria, have a seat at the table.
What good would that do for Nigeria being a part of the G20? I know that trade is important. You have a wider market to reach out to if Nigeria as part of the AU is integrated into the G20. There's also a wider market here in Africa for many of these G20 countries. So it makes the issue of trade even more important. But where do you draw the line, where it becomes, a bit muddled, trying to understand, trying to make that distinction between neocolonization and economic prosperity for all countries?
Yes, obviously, each country has their own agenda, right? And I think that's why some people are having concerns with just the African Union being the representation of countries across the continent. But at the same token, it provides the African continent an opportunity to have one voice, right? Which some would agree that it's a good thing, but also a bad thing. But I go back to what I said earlier in the conversation, that consistent with the membership of not just the EU Commission and other EU bodies, but also the induction of EU countries, right? Because again, it provides nation states the ability to better negotiate. And when you're negotiating as a state, it is better to come as a body, as other states also supporting your position versus just one state defending and supporting a decision. Like, for example, even when it comes to the inclusion of the African Union into the G20, yes, African heads of states did an incredible work for the past decade or so, advocating for their inclusion, which I think for the G20 itself, it is a huge advantage to have political advantage rather to have the inclusion of the African Union within this organization, right? But we also saw how other countries were also supporting the effort, galvanizing other countries and lobbying on behalf of the African Union to see that this happens. We saw that Congressman Meeks, the chair of the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in Washington, D.C., put out statements earlier this year asking for this to take place. We saw the Biden and Harris administration sending letters and putting out statements also supporting this effort. But again, it is not sufficient until countries like Nigeria also has a seat at the table, just like European nations have a seat at the table.
I guess we'll have to develop a wait and see approach. There are so many modalities, I guess, that need to be ironed out before the African Union is fully integrated into the G20, and this could take time, years probably, that we're looking at. Thank you again, Joanna, for joining us on the issue.
Thank you for having me, Amarachi.
Finally on the program, over the weekend, the UK's HMS Trent made its second ever visit to Nigeria, berthing at the Apapa port and welcoming aboard the British Deputy High Commissioner, Johnny Baxter, as well as members of the Nigerian Navy to inspect and rub minds on activities that will take place over the next 4 days. The HMS Trent is a Batch 2 River-class offshore patrol vessel named after the River Trent. It is a third of the new breed of river-class ships, fully operational and most of the time deployed to the Mediterranean to support NATO on its international security mission. Its main mission in Nigeria will be working with the Nigerian Navy to counter piracy, anti-smuggling, provide fishery protection, border patrol, counter-terrorism operations, humanitarian aid, search and rescue, general patrols, and defense diplomacy. This is the HMS Trent's second visit to Nigeria, the first being in October 2021, when it facilitated capabilities demonstrations and training, with 42 Commando delivering specific vessel boarding, search, and seizure training to the Nigerian Navy. It also participated in a charity beach cleanup and a maritime security conference at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs in Lagos. This year, the ship is steered under Commander Tim Langford's leadership.
Looking at activities such as counter-piracy, counter-narcotics activity, and other illicit and illegal activity that takes place on the high seas, such as the increasing trend of things like illegal fishing and unauthorised fishing activity in individual nations' territorial waters and coastlines. But a lot of the discussion will definitely centre around counter-piracy activity. Is one of the things that I think that all nations have got a responsibility to address, and it requires all nations to work closely together to find a working solution to offset the balance of an increasing level of piracy activity on the high seas.
This visit is a fantastic, tangible evidence of the UK's position and how important relationships with countries like Nigeria are. We work together. We are pleased to be supporting the Nigerians. We're very clear that working together is the only way of resolving the kind of problems that are facing the Gulf of Guinea, and it's good that the UK can provide a positive role in that. Nigeria is a massive country for Africa. It has the second largest economy, it has the largest population. And for all of us, for Africa and for the UK, it is critical that Nigeria is stable, is safe, and is prosperous. And that's what we want to achieve. And within that, it is fantastic to see that trade between Nigeria and the UK is currently valued at £7.6 billion, and that has been increasing dramatically. And so the scope of the relationships that the UK has with Nigeria goes from things like this, goes from practical working together to activities that ensure that both our economies prosper.
That's the program this week. I trust it was informative and engaging. Remember, you can always watch this and other editions of the program on youtube.com/channelsweb. Just go to programs on youtube.com/channelsweb, search for Diplomatic Channel, and select the edition you'd like to get back to. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.